Now, for more on China and its United Nations role, I'm joined by Neysun Mahboubi, live from Philadelphia. He's a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Neysun.
Thank you, Rachelle. Glad to be here.
So set the tone for us. What are some of the key ways that China contributes to the United Nations and its goals?
So China has, in the last 10, 15 years, become increasingly involved in the United Nations, probably more so than the other P5 members. China views the United Nations as the premier avenue for it to engage in multilateral activity. So you have the contributions to peacekeeping, which were just referenced in the report just now, the 2,500 troops, the active troops that are part of the peacekeeping missions. And Xi Jinping a couple of years ago announced at the UN that China was going to make a standby force of 8,000 peacekeepers available. China has been very involved in funding. It's the third largest funder of the UN as a whole, the second largest contributor to peacekeeping missions. And again, a couple of years ago at that UN meeting, Xi Jinping suggested that China was going to make huge investments in development aid through the United Nations system. I think $2 billion to South-South initiatives and another $1 billion over 10 years to the Peace and Development Fund. So this is a major ratcheting up of China's activities as measured against the first 10, 15 years of China's involvement in the United Nations.
So then what would you say are China's most pressing concerns when it comes to the United Nations?
I don't know so much about concerns. Certainly it seems as if China sees its involvement in the United Nations system as a way to demonstrate that it's becoming a responsible stakeholder on the world stage. Historically, China had many concerns about state sovereignty, really actually quite similar to the way that President Trump discussed state sovereignty in his speech the last couple of days. And so presumably there's still some legacy of that. But more recently, as measured against some of the rhetoric that China's expressed in the United Nations, speeches like Xi Jinping gave at Davos earlier this year, it may be that China's approach to the United Nations system is shifting a bit.
Now let's look at that. How do you think China's approach of preferring dialogue and cooperation as well as its other goals, how do you see that influencing the UN?
I think it's too early to say. So far, the UN has been an opportunity for China to demonstrate its shifts in thinking as it becomes a different kind of country on the world stage. But I think it's too early to say that China has had an opportunity to really shape the UN or change the overall tenor of the UN. It may be that the United States is starting to give an opportunity for China to do that, in part by encouraging China to become a more active stakeholder and in part by withdrawing itself somewhat. But I think it's too early to say that China has actually fully embraced that role and come to shape the UN in a very noticeable way.
Now let's also look at China's role in the UNGA and how that's developed. How would you say that's really changed over the last 5 to 10 years?
Well, for a long time, China was primarily concerned in the UN system, frankly, with holding the line on state sovereignty. The very few times that China has exercised its veto power in the Security Council has had to do with Security Council actions against particular states. But then in the General Assembly, it seems as if over the first portion of China's involvement in the United Nations has primarily been concerned, frankly, with keeping Taiwan out. That could be shifting now as China starts to see its role on the world stage in much broader terms. But again, I think it's still too early to define exactly how China is going to exercise its newfound interest in the institution beyond those few examples that I've already mentioned: peacekeeping, development aid, and funding.
Now, as you mentioned, according to you, still early days for China in this. So where do you see China then going in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think they could really take a more promising role on?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of us will be paying close attention to that. You think about the different areas that the UN has been most active in its history. Something that clearly jumps out as a possibility would be the environment, given China's interest in that topic, given its role in the Paris Accords. But it's early to say. You know, what we don't know yet is whether, as China becomes a different kind of actor, not just on the world stage, but also in the United Nations system, we don't know yet if China will want to fundamentally change some of these structures, or whether it's going to take on the structures as they are and simply become a more active participant in them. And at the same time, we'll have to see how China's engagement on this stage is affected by its own domestic issues, because that will be a dynamic relationship that we'll have to see how that plays out as well.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your insights, Neysun Mahboubi, research scholar of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania.